Hello, my name's Daniel Hill from the University of Liverpool, and I would like to talk to you today about the meaning of life revisited. Thank you very much for listening to this talk. The title, I've given it this title because I wrote back in 2002 a piece just called The Meaning of Life, and I want today to revisit that talk in the light of certain penetrating criticisms that my friend and colleague Professor Michael Keller has given to that paper. I would like to start with a long quotation from Peter van Imwagen on the meaning of life. And van Imwagen says, "The term meaning has various senses, but none of them lends any sense to the question, what is the meaning of our existence, other than this sense? Explain why we exist in terms of the purposes we serve." If Alice surprises a trusted employee that's broken into her office and is going through her files and asks that person, "What's the meaning of this?" she's requesting an explanation of a certain state of affairs in terms of the purposes of her employee or those whose agent the employee is. Let's just take a step back and think about meaning and language before we apply it to life or existence, in van Imwagen's word. In a linguistic context, the logically primary use of the word meaning is to refer to something that utterers have in their minds when making utterances. And secondarily, it may be extended from utterers to their linguistic acts, and then again to the intended product of those acts, for example, a written inscription, a text. And similarly, I suggest that the word meaning in the present context, meaning of life and existence, may be extended from the agent to the agent's acts, and then to the states of affairs produced by those acts. So we must speak not only of what Alice's employee meant themselves, but also of what their action meant and of the meaning of the state produced by that action. So imagine then that Alice discovered her papers in a mess on the floor and asked, "What's the meaning of this mess?" It's asking there about a state. An answer would consist in telling her that the mess was the result of a purposeful action and what the purpose behind that action was. The mess, however, would have no meaning if it were not the result of a purposeful action, if it had been caused by the wind, perhaps. It would also have no meaning, I suggest, if it had been caused aimlessly by conscious agents accidentally knocking the papers onto the floor without intending to, or by a drunken or entranced agents throwing them on the floor without any ulterior motive. We might want to ask what happens to the meaning of a state of affairs after the purpose with which it was brought about is fulfilled. What if the state continues to exist after the fulfillment of the purpose of the action that produced it? Suppose the papers were left in a mess in order to upset Alice. Is there then still a meaning to the continued existence of the mess if, after getting upset, Alice makes a full recovery, or even if she never gets upset at all? Well, we need to distinguish here between the bare existence of the mess and the continued existence of the mess after a certain time. It may be that the continued existence of the mess has got no meaning, even if the fact of its bare existence does have a meaning. Now, back in 2002, I said this: life has a meaning only if there is an explanation of it in terms of the purposes of an agent that brought life about. Therefore, atheists must necessarily deny that life has a meaning, since no overall complete explanation of the existence of living things could be given in terms of the purposes of any set of non-divine agents. I'll just explain in a couple of steps the way the argument works in that little piece, or where it's supposed to work. Here's the first step, concerns the world, and by the world, by that phrase, I mean the sum of contingent states and events. Now, if the world has a meaning, then that meaning has to be a purpose that it gains from being an intended product of the purposive action of a necessary being, such as God. And that's because no contingent being would have existed beforehand to have endowed the world from its very first moment with meaning. Secondly, no contingent being, as a matter of fact, actually does create itself, or even create everything else, or even create most of the things. I'm assuming, by the way, that simultaneous and retroactive causation are impossible here. Now, the second step of my argument in 2002 was meant to be concerned with life. So by the word life, I mean the sum of the lives of living things. If life has a meaning, then that meaning has to be a purpose that it gains from being an intended product of the purposive action of a non-living being, again, such as God. This is because no living being would have existed beforehand to have endowed life from its very first moment with meaning. And secondly, no living being, as a matter of fact, gives life to itself, or even to everything else, or even to most other things. Again, I'm assuming that simultaneous and retroactive life-giving are impossible. Now, you might worry about how we'd know the non-living being was God, but in fact, we'll skip over that for the present because Professor Housekeller's criticisms focus on a different area. Finally, individual lives. What about individual lives such as mine and yours? Well, an individual's life could be endowed with meaning by their parents. After all, parents may produce children for various reasons, such as to look after them when they're old. And in fact, this example shows that a life can have more than one meaning, because a life can be the product of a joint action undertaken with different intentions. And in fact, a life can even have two meanings in tension with each other. So you couldn't fulfill both. Perhaps, for example, one parent decides to have a child to provide someone to go away and earn money, whereas the other parent decides to have a child in order to provide someone to stay at home as their full-time carer. Now, this is Professor Housekeller's criticisms here. When we ask about meaning in life, we're not really asking for an explanation at all. Instead, in many cases, what we're asking for is a justification. If life has a purpose, that purpose does not answer our question about life's meaning, or if it does, then not because it is life's purpose, but because it gives us a reason to live and to find our life worth living. The question we want answered is why we should live, or why we should go on living. That's Professor Housekeller's response to me. He also provides some counterexamples. He says, if, for instance, God had created life because he thought he might enjoy the spectacle while suffering, then, on my view, that would be the meaning of our life, which he thinks is absurd. Or if my role in God's plan were to amass the largest collection of bottle caps, then that would be the meaning of my life, however trivial collecting bottle caps may appear to me and to everyone else. Again, he thinks that's absurd. Finally, if God had created us to forever roll rocks up a hill, only to see them roll down again shortly before we get to the top, then this would be the meaning of our life, even though such a life, the life of a Sisyphus, is widely seen as a paradigmatic case of a life entirely devoid of meaning. Here's now my response to Michael Housekeller. So here I'm moving on from what I said in 2002. I agree with Michael Housekeller that there's a difference in meaning between the phrase the meaning of life and the phrase meaning in life, or a life's being meaningful. I think he's right there. I note the adjective meaningful, by the way, seems stronger than the noun meaning. We normally reserve the adjective meaningful for valuable things or actions done from a valuable purpose. It doesn't normally suffice for an event to be called meaningful that someone brought it about for a purpose. And here's an example from D.H. Lawrence's novel Women in Love. Gudrun paddled softly, lingeringly, longing for Gerald to say something meaningful. Gudrun wouldn't have been satisfied by just any utterance that Gerald uttered with some purpose or other. When Lawrence says she's longing for him to say something meaningful, he means that she wants him to say something with a valuable purpose. For example, telling her how he feels about her. This isn't a picture of Gudrun, by the way. This is just a more generic illustration. Okay, let's think how else I can respond to Michael Housekeller. Despite what I've just said in agreement, I still believe that the meaning of the word meaning in the phrase question, what is the meaning of life, just as in the question, what is the meaning of this, relates to purpose. Nevertheless, I agree with Michael Housekeller that when people talk about the meaning of life, often what they really want is an answer to a different question, about what would make their lives meaningful. Here's the connection that I see between these two notions. In the first case, we look at the purpose with which life was brought into being. But when people ask, what is the meaning of life, they're often asking, is there a purpose that I should make my own for my life? Now to turn to Michael Keller's counterexamples. Let's look at the Sisyphus one. Is there a meaning to Sisyphus's life in the underworld? Well, actually, yes. The gods had a purpose of punishment in letting him continue to live there. They didn't annihilate him. They allowed him, indeed ordered him, to carry on living in Tartarus in order to be punished. Now, is his task, as opposed to his life, is his task meaningful? No. Sisyphus' task doesn't fulfill any valuable purpose in and of itself. That's why it's chosen for him. It does fulfill a valuable purpose extrinsically by serving as a punishment, but in and of itself, it's meaningless. Now let's turn to Professor Keller's other counterexamples. What if the life fulfills a purpose, but it's an evil or trivial purpose? What if my parents brought me into existence to have a bottle top collector, and that for its own sake, not for any further purpose? Or what if sadistic parents brought me into the world just to see me suffer? Okay, I'd be under no moral obligation to make either of those my purposes, make either my own. But what if in fact I did actually dedicate my life to one of those purposes? In that case, I say there'd still be a meaning to my life, because as I said, you have the purpose there, but it wouldn't be a meaningful life. And that's because these purposes aren't valuable, even if they're mistakenly valued. Now, does this concession that I've made to Michael Keller make a difference to the actual argument of my piece in 2002? Well, if God exists, as I was presupposing back in 2002, there's little practical difference between life's having a meaning and life being meaningful. The reason is this: if God exists, then he created everything for a purpose, since God is by definition rational and does nothing without a purpose. Moreover, God's purpose in acting is never evil or trivial. He can't create on a whim. Possibly, I admit, God had more than one purpose in creating the world, and possibly God had a different purpose even for each different created things. And more than this, it's also possible that God had multiple different purposes for the world as a whole, or even for each individual thing in it. But despite all that, we still have the view that God has a purpose. Now, you might object to what I've said so far like this. You might say, okay, maybe God had a purpose for starting creation off, but maybe God then left creation to unroll according to fixed laws, or maybe even according to chance. If that were the case, then what I said wouldn't be true. It wouldn't be true that everything in the world had a purpose, even if the world as a whole had a purpose, and the first thing in the world had a purpose. But that isn't the God in whom theists believe, not the God I was presupposing in 2002. That's the God in which deists believe. The theist believes that nothing, even trivial or evil things, happens without God's permission or concurrence. Now, it doesn't follow from God's having a non-evil, non-trivial purpose in creating me that I can adopt that purpose as mine. I admit that. God has a purpose in creating rocks, for example, but rocks can't adopt that purpose for themselves. But what's the best purpose that we can adopt if God exists? Well, God is by definition the greatest being in the universe. So the most important purpose is to glorify him, and I say we can do that. Secondly, God is our benefactor, so I say we should repay his kindness by obeying him, and again, we can do that. Here's a nice couple of quotations from Jonathan Edwards from 1740 on this question. As it is a thing valuable and desirable in itself, that God's glory should be seen and known, so it seems equally reasonable and fit that it should be valued and esteemed, loved and delighted in, answerably to its dignity. So that therefore it's morally obligatory on us to glorify God. Secondly, humans are capable of actively promoting God's glory, and this is what they ought to make their ultimate end in all things. If you think this is something that I've just as well made up, it is in fact implicit in the Christian scriptures. So God created us intending that we should glorify him. Isaiah teaches that. These are all hyperlinked, by the way. If you want to check out the references, you can get a copy of my slides. God created us physically capable of glorifying him. as Luke's Gospel says, it's a moral duty on anything that can glorify God to do so, as we saw from Jonathan Edwards a moment ago. We owe God a great debt, as Matthew 18 teaches, and God actually asks us to glorify him in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. Finally, we should do what our benefactors ask us to do, other things be equal. For example, assuming it's not immoral. And therefore, for two separate reasons, one, it's our moral duty anyway, and secondly, because God's our special benefactor, we should make it our purpose, the meaning of our lives, to glorify God. Let's revisit the counterexamples again. Suppose that collecting bottle tops did somehow glorify God. Well, then I say, yes, a life spent doing that would be meaningful. You'd be contributing to the most important, valuable thing in the world, glorifying God. Could Sisyphus' endlessly pushing a boulder uphill glorify God? Well, in the myth, Sisyphus' task does serve a meaningful end, justice. And I say, if justice really did prescribe boulder pushing as a punishment, then indeed a perfectly just creator would intend that punishment. I just want to note that it doesn't follow from a life being meaningful that every moment of that life, taken in isolation, must be meaningful. What about the example of an immoral purpose? Well, God, being perfectly moral, wouldn't ask us to do something immoral, so that doesn't apply. What about the example if I'm brought up to suffer? Well, if my suffering contributes to glorifying God, then again, that would be meaningful. And a life, even life full of suffering, would be meaningful if it glorified God. Conclusion. I'm not meaning to suggest today that God created each of us with only one purpose in mind for that purpose to fulfill. In fact, I've said maybe many purposes. Nor do I mean to suggest that the glory of God is literally the only possible thing of value. Consequently, while I maintain that atheism implies that life does not have meaning in the sense of purpose, I'm not saying that it implies that individual lives can't be meaningful. That said, if God does exist, glorifying God is by so much the greatest good that that any life not aimed at fulfilling that purpose is missing out on maximal meaningfulness and looks paltry in comparison. I'd like just to close with a few thoughts from Augustine, or one thought from Augustine. We are in fact, I assert, made by God in such a way that when we are functioning as designed, we don't find ultimate meaning in anything other than glorifying God. We are made, in fact, to find other things ultimately unsatisfying. As Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to any comments you may have.